Okay, has Jamie talked with y'all about slabs at all? Like, do y'all know how to use the slab roller or even roll out slabs? Okay, so we're gonna start there. So these, I went ahead and rolled out so they would be setting up just a little bit. You can work with slabs pretty wet, but sometimes it's a lot easier if you let them set up just a little bit so they kind of support their own weight. And so you have kind of 3 different ways to make a slab. The easiest being on the slab roller right there, but you can also roll it out with a rolling pin, and you can also like pound it out with your hand. So I'm going to show you each way just so that you'll have options. Alright, so if you don't have a rolling pin or a slab roller, if you just start with a fairly flat piece of clay, you can kind of pound it with the palm of your hand. And you're just looking for a pretty even consistency. If you flip it back and forth, it'll help the slab get a little bit more even. And you want to bring that down to about 1/4 inch. It's a pretty simple method, but it does take a little bit longer than using the slab roller or a rolling pin. And if you have like wrist issues for any reason, I don't recommend doing this either, because it's only going to make them worse. Okay, so we look like we're at a pretty even consistency. It's about 1/4 inch thickness. So there's option 1, or you can take clay and put into the slab roller. I'll just show you over here. Let me turn this. Okay. There is different canvas in here. There's canvas that will have like a red tint to it. It's used for red clay. I wouldn't use it on your white clay, because all that's going to do is take that red pigment and put it onto your clay, and then you're like never going to get that out. So definitely just use the clay, the canvas that's for the white clay. So it's best if these are the little dials that will change the thickness of what this roller is. So you've got a little measuring tool here, and it goes all the way up to 3 inches and then all the way down to 0. I typically start out with 1/2 inch and roll it through once, and that kind of just, it's a little bit easier on the slab roller, so it's not having to put so much pressure on the clay at one time. And you can see like it flattened that out. It's completely even all the way around. Then I'll take it and I'll turn it. That way it's getting compressed from all angles. And then I'll push it down to a little less than 1/4 inch. And then pull it back through. And again, you can see it's completely consistent. You get like a really nice even slab. And then I'll do it one more time at 1/4 inch. And just when you're doing this, make sure you don't get your fingers anywhere close to this, because it will pull your fingers into it. Okay? So now you've got this really even slab that's completely consistent, and it's really easy to work with at that point. Now bringing it out of the slab roller, you just want to make sure you're taking a rib and compressing it, because what that slab roller does when it's moving the clay and flattening it out, it's moving it all in one direction. And all that's going to do later when you're building, let's say you were, maybe not so much with cups, but if you were to slab build a plate or something, all that's going to do is make your plate, when it dries, it's going to start warping, because all those platelets in the clay are going to want to dry in the same direction, so it can make the rim of your plate or something like start to lift up. So just go back after you roll it and compress your slab in all directions. And then flip it and compress on the back side as well.
You need very much pressure to do it.
You don't. You're gonna be able to tell that there's a little bit of pressure that you're putting on it, but not so much that you're like forcing the clay out or anything, because you still want to keep it at that same thickness. Okay. And then I'll show you with this one that I kind of just smacked out with my hand. You can tell these are still pretty wet. So that's why I have these laying out, because if they're this wet, it's kind of hard to get them to stand up to make a cup. I'm gonna borrow this, but I'll disinfect it. So with your rolling pin, let's say you have a piece of clay and it's kind of pounded out, but it's not completely even. Just take your rolling pin, always start in the middle and work your way out. You're just gonna evenly roll that from the middle out on each side. And all that's doing is getting that a little bit more even than it was before. It gets rid of like all the like little dimples and inconsistencies in the clay. So it's not anything like complicated, but the rolling pin does help in that case. Now, as far as slab building, you can make this as easy or as complicated as you would like. I slab build all of my work, so you can make it very complicated. But I'll start with a very simple one first, just so that you kind of know how easy you can make it. And then we'll go up from there. I'm going to show you 3 different kinds. We're going to do one basic cup. We're going to do one with a template. And then I'm going to show you one where you can implement darting to get kind of a different shape to your form. So with the first one just being very simple, this is just a rectangle. I cut it out. It's about the size that I like my cups. You can play with this size. It's not anything set in stone, but I just lay that out. It's a little bit easier for me to get like a perfect rectangle. And you can use, I'm using like the little knife end. I'm not sure if y'all have this tool. I'm using that, but you can also use your needle tool to cut that if you want. All right, once you have that, like I said, they're kind of soft, but they'll stand up as long as you let them sit out for a second. And so all I do at that point is take my slip and my scoring tool, and I will score the edges and attach that. Set this up here. So I'll attach it at one end, and I will take my rib and this like little seam up at the top, I'll go over with my rib just so that that point is like really adhered together. And then I'll flip it and squish the other end together and do the same thing. And it also helps if you'll pick up the cup, like it's really wobbly, but if you'll pick it up and just take your finger and kind of smush down that seam on the inside, that will help you in the long run when you're moving this around. It'll keep it from cracking. It just helps it stay together a little bit better. Now this is where your banding wheel comes in handy. So you see all the rings, it's the same as like your wheel head. So use those as like a point of reference. So when I put it up here, I know it's a little bit smaller than this ring right here. So I'm gonna cut a circle to be about that same size for the bottom. It doesn't need to be perfect. You can always trim it later. So when I stick that on there, it's almost exactly the size that I need. And so then you're just gonna score and slip that together as well. I don't know if there's anybody that's like just totally hating the wheel throwing. But if you don't get the wheel throwing right off bat and you don't really like pinching, this is a really good like alternative to both of those. And you can get a lot of cups made really quickly this way. So I'll just kind of sit that together. And we'll give that a minute to kind of set up. If you try to pick it up immediately with the clay this wet, it'll just pull it back off the bottom. And then I use these little sculpting tools. It's like this little silicone tip. They work really good, but if you don't have that, that's fine. Just use like the end of a paintbrush, something round, and go in, and all I'm doing is placing that right on that seam inside and just compressing all of that together and covering up the crack where I put it together. It's like you're just smoothing out the seam. But you can do it, like I said, with a paintbrush as well. Let's see. All right, so you can lift it up a little bit. I flip mine over. And then you can use like a paddle. Sometimes you can use the end of your hand and just kind of lightly tap that together. That's just gonna make sure all the little air bubbles are out and everything is connected like it should be. And then at this point, if you don't want a completely flat bottom, you can tap the middle of that lightly and it will give you this kind of angled bottom. There's a slight curve to it. And then you can flip it back over. And then I don't know about you, but the lips on my cup, I prefer them to be rounded. I've seen cups that have square lips, but I just go back in and lightly pinch the top of my cup. And you can go back and smooth that out with a sponge or whatever you want. You can even use your chamois because you can spin your banding wheel like the regular potter's wheel and use your chamois on it if you want. But that just kind of smooths that out. Most of the time I kind of shape it to what I think looks close to a circle. I know some people are a little bit more tedious about that. You can use like a styrofoam cup and sit in there and it will make that perfectly round. Just let it dry. Maybe like 20 minutes with the styrofoam cup sitting inside of it and it will keep the lip of that round. So that's your easy cup. And of course you can, carve on that and do whatever you want from there to make it a little bit more complex. Okay, now with the templates that I use, I've got different sizes, but basically I make the cups out of tar paper, and then once they're cut into templates, I can then cut them out of slabs and fold them together. So this is gonna serve as the base. So we'll put that together, and then this is gonna sit on top. So you're gonna have like this tapered bottom to your cup or mug. I use these as mugs. So we're just gonna cut these out. I'm going to compress my slab real quick. Does anyone have any questions so far? I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory, but I may be skipping something. So we're gonna cut these out. And then making these templates, all I did was like trace something circular. It could be a Tupperware bowl, could be, depending on how big the template is you're needing, it could be the end of like a bucket. Let's see. All right, so once you have these cut out, I go ahead and sit this one up kind of like in a circle and just let it kind of set up like this. That way, if it starts to set up too quickly, a lot of times if we have this back garage door open or if the fan or the air's going, they'll get dry a lot quicker than you think. And so just going ahead and having it in that circular motion will let it set up how it's going to sit later. So we're gonna go ahead and score and slit the ends of this circle. You just stand it up and stick it together, and I promise you it will stay. Like I said, they're still pretty wet. If you're more comfortable working a little bit drier, you can let this set up a little bit more. I've gotten used to working with them pretty wet, so I'm fairly comfortable with doing so. Also, when you cut out that circle, you've got this little section that you cut out of the circle to make it fold like that. That's like the perfect size for that to be the very base, like the bottom of your cup. So I usually cut that out, and I'll taper down the edges just by like putting a little bit of pressure on it. You can do this with a sponge as well. It just smooths the edges out. And at this point, when you're slab building, I find it a lot easier if you're going to put your initials on your piece, or if you have a stamp or something. It's a lot easier to go ahead and do that now, and while you have the piece pressed to the table, and then it's on there later and you're not having to worry about it. Okay? So when you sit this on there, it's gonna have a little bit of an overhang, but it's good for stability. You don't want to cut it down the exact size of the bottom, especially when there's this much of like a taper, because then when you go to use it, you're probably just going to knock it over. So we scored and slipped, and we're going to sit that on there. I don't know if everyone can see that. All I've done is stuck that little bit of clay onto the bottom. Then you just want to press it on there from the inside, just to make sure everything's attached. Because if not, you can get, that's like a really good spot that you could get cracks in later. Right, if everyone can see, like where I've smoothed it out on the inside. Okay, from here is just where you're going to take this piece, like we did earlier, just attach it at the seam, and then we're just gonna sit it on top of what we just made. And for these, I don't know how you score and slip currently, but because there's such a harsh angle from here to the top piece, I score and slip both sides. It just makes me look at it as more of like a zipper. So you have teeth on both sides of a zipper, and that's kind of what your score marks are. So when you score both sides, it's just kind of like that zipper, like interlocking, so it holds a little bit better. Okay. Now some of you may not like the seams. I make all this, I have like a hole in my seams showing on my work. You can go in with a rib and get rid of the seams if that's not something that you like. I would just wait for it to set up just a little bit before you go in with a rib and start trying to take the seam out. Okay, once it's like kind of connected, I'll flip this over, and I'm letting it lightly rest on the side, and I'm using my left hand to hold the top portion of the cup, and I'm using my thumb to push that seam in. And I'm just going to rotate it all the way around. It's just going to make sure that all the air bubbles and everything are out and everything's like really connected. You don't want to like let it dry and then it like pop apart once it's dry. So when you're squishing these together, you should get like a lot of that slip that just like naturally squeezes out of the seam. That's when you know that you like have it good and connected. Okay. So at this point, this is where I'm gonna go back in with the end of your paintbrush or whatever tool you have and just lightly run that around the seam just to make sure it's all connected. And then I'm gonna go back and lightly pinch the top. And then because it's really wet, it may sink one to one side or the other, and it may not be upright. So you can kind of wiggle this around however you need. Again, if you don't like the seam, you can go through with a sponge and kind of clean that up. You can do it with a rib. Just whatever it is that you like to do with your pots. Okay, so that's kind of cup number 2. Does anyone have any questions about this one? Okay. And then for the third one, this one's a little bit different. It's just if you don't want to waste your time, I don't consider it wasting your time, but if you don't want to deal with making a template, if you don't have time or you don't have access to tar paper, which we do have tar paper, I can get you if that's what you want to do. This is another way to get a little bit of a different shape rather than just like this plain cylinder, without having any like extra tools. Has anyone ever, like, I know this is so old lady to ask this, but has anyone ever like sewn before? Like, do you know what darting is? Okay, so a lot of people have no idea what I'm talking about when I say that, but basically you're just removing like a V shape or a football shape so you can bring that clay together, and then it gives the cup or the mug that you're making a completely different shape. So we're gonna go ahead and attach this. Now I'm not going to completely make this one just because I want to show y'all a couple different ways you can do this. So it's probably going to look pretty janky towards the end. But, so if this is you start with a cylinder, and all I did was cut this out of the same rectangle that I've been using for everything else. You can go through and make like a little line with your ruler just so you know, like you have a straight up and down line here. And then I always use the 1/3, 2/3 rule. And so this cylinder is exactly 3 inches. So I am going to make a mark 1 inch down. Anything more than that, it can get a little bit crazy to work with. So all I've done here is mark 1 inch down, and then I've marked here and here, which is a 1/2 inch on each side, so it's 1 inch total. And so if you connect those lines, you're gonna get this nice little V right there that you're gonna cut out. Did everyone see that? Okay. So then if you cut that out and you score and slip both sides and push it together, you're gonna get a different shaped base than you would have originally. So you see how that brings that in some? So all that's gonna do, if you do that on, like, let's say you did that on 4 sides, you're gonna get this like square bottom on your cup. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this on the other sides just so you can see what this looks like. And then I'll show you one more place you can dart from there. If you get lazy, you can just take your V that you just cut off and stick up here and trace it. That way you're not like measuring every time. You're gonna score and slip all of these and then put them together. I would just be really careful when you're putting these together because you are like bending the clay dramatically. Just to kind of support it on both sides with your hand as you're pushing it together, because you don't want anything to like crack or stretch in a weird way. All right, so once you get that done, then the bottom of your cup is square and then it's round on top. So it kind of gives you a different look, and it also gives you like this really nice shadow underneath, which could do some really cool things when you're glazing later. And so let's say that you wanted to put a handle on this, but you don't want the handle on the side, you want it like above the corner or something. Well, that might be like an awkward spot to put a handle, so you can always draw like a little football shape. A really shallow football. Don't make it too big or it's like, it will be too big to like fill back in. Maybe an almond shape would be a better, because footballs aren't that skinny. But you're just gonna make this tiny little incision. And then you'll score and slip that. And then when you push it in, it gives you a nice little indent for your fingers to rest in when you put a handle on. So, that is all I have to show you. Does anyone have any questions? If everyone's good, then I am done with my demo.
When you roll it out, how long should you wait until you start trying to roll it into the cylinder?
So I would give it about 10-15 minutes depending on how humid it is outside. Check it after 10 minutes. If it still seems pretty wet, leave it for 5-10 more minutes and come back to it.
Should we have the handle slots still wet like that?
I let them, after I make it, I let them sit out for about 20 minutes and then apply handles after that. So you don't have to let them sit long, but I would let it set up just a little bit so you don't like distort the shape that you've made.
Thank you.
You're welcome.